He finally told his own family what really happened, and now the entire story around Lil Jeff's death is being questioned again. That single line started circulating across social media pages tied to street news commentary, and it immediately pulled the situation back into the spotlight. Not because anything new was officially confirmed, but because of the way the rumor was framed. A so-called killer, allegedly speaking to his own family about what happened on the day Lil Jeff died. And in moments like this, the internet doesn't wait for clarity. It builds narratives from fragments. What makes the situation explode even more is the way older clips, old posts, and past street commentary suddenly resurfaced at the same time. Nothing new was verified, but timing alone was enough to restart discussions that had already gone cold months ago. And now the question spreading online is simple. Was there really a confession, or is this another case of the internet turning silence into a story? Before any of this recent noise, Lil Jeff's name had already become part of a larger street conversation that never fully settled. His story, his relationships, and the circumstances around his death were already surrounded by speculation, partial accounts, and conflicting narratives from different people online and in the community. That background tension is what made this new wave of rumors hit harder. Because when a story never gets fully closed, even the smallest detail can reopen everything. The turning point in this entire situation didn't come from a court document, a police statement, or any official confirmation. It came from a short, heavily circulated claim online that someone allegedly connected to the case had spoken to family and explained what really happened. That single idea changed the entire direction of the conversation, because up until that point, most of the discussion around Lil Jeff's death had been fragmented. Different accounts, different timelines, different interpretations of the same moment. But this new rumor introduced something different. The idea of a direct explanation from someone allegedly involved. And once that idea entered the space, the internet filled in the rest. Within hours, commentary pages began stitching together older posts, memorial messages, and unrelated street commentary clips, as if they were all part of one continuous chain of events. Screenshots were reposted with bold captions suggesting truth revealed, or family finally knows what happened, even though none of those claims could be traced back to a verified source. But the narrative had already taken shape, and that's when the first major twist formed. Because instead of focusing on what was actually confirmed, attention shifted toward interpretation of intent. Who allegedly said what, who allegedly knew what, and who allegedly remained silent during key moments surrounding the incident. Old footage of Lil Jeff's circle started resurfacing again. Interviews where people spoke about loyalty, neighborhood ties, and internal conflicts were re-examined under a completely different lens. Even neutral statements were being reinterpreted as hidden references to unresolved tension. And that's where the story stopped being about a single incident and started becoming about everything surrounding it. Then came the moment that escalated things further. A short clip began circulating showing someone indirectly referencing miscommunication after the fact, in a way that viewers immediately connected to the ongoing narrative. No names were mentioned, no direct confirmation was given, but the timing of the clip was enough to push the story into full escalation mode. Because in viral environments like this, timing often matters more than clarity. The clip was reposted thousands of times within hours, each version adding new captions, new assumptions, and new interpretations. Some users claimed to confirm the earlier rumor about a private explanation being given to family members. Others insisted it had nothing to do with the situation at all. But neither side could prove their interpretation, and that uncertainty only fueled more engagement. Meanwhile, older posts from Lil Jeff's acquaintances and community members began resurfacing again. Messages posted shortly after the incident were being reanalyzed for hidden meaning. Even condolences and tribute posts were being read as if they contained coded references to what really happened. And that's when the emotional weight of the situation deepened. Because Lil Jeff's name wasn't just being discussed as part of a rumor cycle. It was being tied to ongoing grief, unanswered questions, and unresolved narratives that had never been fully clarified in public. The internet wasn't just revisiting the story. It was rebuilding it in real time. At the same time, another layer of escalation formed when commentary creators began presenting breakdowns of the situation as if they were reconstructing a timeline. They used stitched clips, reposted screenshots, and selective references to build a structured narrative out of scattered fragments. But the problem was simple. None of the fragments came from a single verified source. Still, the structure made the story feel real. And once something feels structured, people start believing it has to be true. This is where the second layer of confusion entered the situation. Because while some viewers believed they were witnessing a hidden truth being uncovered, others argued they were watching a narrative being built entirely through repetition and emotional interpretation. And both sides started clashing online. Arguments broke out in comment sections, not just about what happened, but about what was even credible enough to consider evidence. People debated whether reposted clips counted as proof, whether indirect statements mattered, and whether silence from key figures meant anything at all. But through all of this noise, one thing stayed consistent. There was still no confirmed, official clarification about the claims being circulated, and that absence kept the story open. Then came the second major twist. A new claim began circulating suggesting that different versions of the story being shared online may have originated from separate conversations that were never meant to be linked together. In other words, multiple unrelated comments, interviews, and reactions may have been merged by timing and repetition into a single narrative that feels unified, even if it wasn't originally connected that way. This idea changed everything, because now the conversation wasn't just about Lil Jeff anymore. It was about how easily fragmented information can become a complete story when viewed through viral momentum. And that realization split the audience even further. Some people doubled down on the idea that something deeper must have happened behind the scenes. Others began questioning whether the entire situation was being shaped more by interpretation than by actual confirmed events. And in that divide, the story stopped moving toward clarity and started moving deeper into uncertainty. After the first wave of interpretation settled, the situation around Lil Jeff didn't cool down. It fractured into even more versions of itself. What was once a single circulating claim about a confession to family now became a wider argument about timelines, motives, and whether multiple unrelated moments were being forced into one unified story by online repetition. And that's when escalation really took hold. A second wave of content started spreading, this time focusing less on the original rumor and more on supporting context, pulled from older posts, interviews, and community commentary. Creators began building layered breakdowns that stitched together unrelated clips, not necessarily to mislead, but to make sense of scattered information that never had a confirmed structure in the first place. But the more it was stitched together, the more convincing it appeared. One of the most viral pieces during this phase was a short commentary clip where someone referenced people speaking differently after fact. Even though the clip didn't mention Lil Jeff directly, it was immediately tied into the ongoing narrative because of timing and audience expectation. That connection alone was enough to push the story into another escalation cycle. And once again, interpretation replaced confirmation. This is where the second major twist began forming. Not from new evidence, but from pattern recognition. People started noticing that similar phrasing, similar repost timing, and similar emotional framing were appearing across multiple unrelated posts. Some saw it as organic reaction from a community processing grief and unresolved questions. Others began suggesting that content creators and repost pages were unintentionally reinforcing each other's narratives, creating the illusion of coordinated clarity where none actually existed. And that idea changed how the story was being viewed. Because now the question wasn't just what happened. It became, why does it keep feeling like it's being structured into a storyline? Meanwhile, older community posts connected to Lil Jeff's circle resurfaced again. Messages of mourning, short tributes, and emotional reflections were being revisited and reanalyzed. But instead of being treated as closure, they were being treated as puzzle pieces, each one potentially holding hidden meaning when placed next to the new circulating rumor. This is where the emotional intensity increased. Because Lil Jeff's name wasn't just part of a trending topic anymore. It was part of an ongoing reconstruction of memory. People weren't just discussing events. They were reinterpreting the emotional atmosphere around those events through a new lens shaped by speculation. And that's what made everything feel heavier than a typical online rumor cycle. At the same time, commentary channels accelerated the narrative by producing updated timelines. These videos didn't introduce new confirmed facts, but they organized existing fragments into structured sequences. Timestamps were suggested, Sequences were implied, and emotional framing made it feel like a complete picture was emerging. But the core issue remained the same. No single verified source tied everything together. Still, the structure itself gave the illusion of clarity, and that illusion spread faster than any correction could keep up with. The second major twist fully landed when viewers began questioning whether the story was actually evolving through new information, or simply being reshaped through repeated reinterpretation of the same limited set of fragments. In other words, people started realizing that every update might not be new at all. It might just be a different framing of the same unclear foundation. And that realization split the audience even more sharply. One side argued that where there's this much recurring attention, there must be something unresolved at the core. The other side argued that the cycle itself was proof of how easily online narratives can expand without new evidence, driven entirely by engagement, timing, and emotional response. And neither side could fully disprove the other, because there was still no official confirmation to anchor either interpretation. And in the middle of that tension, something else began happening quietly. The conversation started drifting away from specifics and moving toward pattern-based thinking. Instead of asking what happened, people began asking how these stories form in the first place, how fragmented clips become narratives, how silence becomes meaning, and how repetition can transform uncertainty into perceived truth. That shift made the situation bigger than Lil Jeff alone. It turned into a case study in how modern viral storytelling works. And once that shift happened, the narrative stopped being about a single incident and started becoming about the way the internet builds reality from fragments. By the time the discussion around Lil Jeff reached its widest spread, it had moved far beyond a single rumor cycle. What started as a claim circulating on smaller pages had now entered mainstream commentary spaces, where it was being discussed not as one isolated event, but as a developing narrative built from fragments, reposts, and emotional interpretation. And that shift changed everything about how people reacted. On Twitter, the response split in real time. One group treated the situation as a tragic reminder of how quickly unverified information can spread when emotions are high and details are unclear. They focus on a lack of confirmation, pointing out how multiple versions of the same story were circulating without any official grounding. The other group leaned into the idea that where there is this much repetition, there must be some unresolved truth behind it, even if it hasn't been publicly clarified. Reddit threads expanded the conversation even further. Users began compiling timelines based on reposted clips, older community messages, and commentary videos. They attempted to organize everything into a single sequence, even when the sources didn't fully align. What stood out most was how confident some interpretations became despite the absence of verified information, showing how structure itself can create a sense of credibility. On YouTube, breakdown channels played a major role in escalating the emotional weight of the situation. Edited compilations, slowed down clips, and narrative-driven commentary turned fragmented moments into a continuous storyline. Even neutral or unrelated footage was sometimes presented as potentially relevant context, depending on how it was framed within the video. And with each new upload, the story gained more perceived depth. In community spaces closer to the situation, the reaction was more personal and emotional. People who followed Lil Jeff's life more closely expressed frustration, confusion, and concern about how quickly the narrative was expanding online. For them, the biggest issue wasn't just the rumor itself. It was how rapidly different versions of the story were being accepted as fact without clear confirmation. At the same time, a quieter but important reaction was happening in media circles. Commentary hosts and discussion platforms began to tread more carefully when addressing the topic. Instead of presenting strong claims, many shifted toward discussing how narratives form online, using the situation as an example of how quickly fragmented information can evolve into a widely believed storyline. This cautious approach added another layer to the public perception, because when mainstream voices avoid firm conclusions, audiences often interpret that absence as either uncertainty or hidden complexity, even when neither is confirmed. Meanwhile, older emotional posts related to Lil Jeff began circulating again. Tributes, messages, and reflections from his circle were being reposted with new captions that connected them to the ongoing rumor cycle. But in most cases, these posts were originally unrelated to the new claims. They were simply being recontextualized through timing and repetition. This is where the emotional intensity of the situation became most visible. People weren't just reacting to information anymore. They were reacting to interpretation layered on top of interpretation. Grief, curiosity, frustration, and confusion all mixed together in comment sections and discussion threads. And once emotions enter that cycle, clarity becomes harder to maintain. Because every new post feels like it adds meaning, even when it might not actually add new facts. And through all of this, the most consistent pattern remained unchanged. There was still no confirmed statement addressing the core claim that started the entire wave. But the absence of clarity didn't slow the conversation down. It made it more unstable. Because now, every silence, every repost, and every fragmented clip was being treated as part of a larger picture that still hadn't been officially defined. And that's what kept the story alive. Not confirmation, but interpretation. By the time the conversation reached its final stage, the story around Lil Jeff had already shifted into something no longer fully tied to any single claim, clip, or source. What remained was a layered mix of interpretation, reposted fragments, and emotional reactions that had been circulating for so long that they started to feel like structure, even without official confirmation holding them together. And that's where the final twist begins. A new angle started appearing in smaller discussion spaces, not as a new revelation, but as a pattern people were beginning to notice. Users pointed out that the most viral version of the story wasn't actually built from one consistent source. It was built from multiple unrelated moments being repeated together until they felt connected. Different timestamps, different posts, different comments slowly merged into a single narrative through repetition and timing. That observation changed how some people were interpreting everything that came before it, because it raised a difficult question. Was the story being uncovered or assembled? At the same time, older posts connected to Lil Jeff's circle were being re-examined yet again. But instead of providing clarity, they added more uncertainty. Messages that once felt emotionally straightforward were now being read through a different lens, one shaped by the ongoing rumor cycle. Even simple tributes were being analyzed for hidden meaning, despite no evidence that they were ever intended that way. And that's when the second layer of the twist appeared. A circulating theory suggested that the confession of family narrative may itself be a reinterpretation of indirect conversations that were never meant to be publicly framed as a single explanatory moment. In other words, what people understood as one clear revelation might actually be multiple unrelated discussions being merged together by online repetition and timing. This idea didn't confirm anything, but it destabilized everything, because it meant the most viral part of the entire story might not be a moment at all, but a constructed interpretation of several smaller, disconnected moments. And once that possibility entered the conversation, certainty started to collapse. Fans who believed they were following a developing truth began rechecking timelines. Commentary channels started adjusting phrasing. Even earlier breakdowns suddenly looked less definitive when viewed through this new lens of uncertainty. But despite all of that, the story didn't disappear. It evolved again. Because uncertainty doesn't end viral narratives, it extends them. Now, the conversation wasn't just about what happened to Lil Jeff. It was about how easily multiple fragments of information could become a single perceived truth when repeated enough times across different platforms. And that realization left the audience with one final question that no clip or post could fully answer. If everything being discussed came from fragments that were never fully confirmed as a single story, then where does the real truth actually begin? And where does interpretation take over? And as the internet continues looping the same clips, the same posts, and the same theories, one thing becomes clear. This story isn't closing. It's just being rewritten again. Now, after everything that's been broken down, the real question isn't just about Lil Jeff anymore. It's about how stories like this actually form in the first place. Because what you've just seen is how fast fragments can turn into something that feels complete. A clip here, a post there, a comment that gets reposted, and suddenly the internet starts treating disconnected moments like they're part of one solid timeline. And once that happens, it becomes almost impossible to separate what was actually confirmed from what was simply repeated enough times to feel true. That's why the situation hit so differently for so many people. Some will say this is a case of misinformation spreading faster than clarity, where emotional reaction and timing build a narrative that never had a fully verified foundation. Others will argue that repeated attention usually points to something unresolved underneath, even if the details online aren't perfectly accurate. But the uncomfortable part is this: both perspectives can feel believable depending on how you look at it. So now it comes down to you. Do you think this entire situation is an example of the internet building a story out of fragments that were never meant to be connected in the first place? Or do you think there's a deeper layer that hasn't been clearly explained publicly, which is why the conversation keeps coming back? Because in today's world, attention doesn't just follow truth. It also follows repetition, timing, and emotion. And once a narrative reaches that level, it stops belonging to the original source and starts belonging to everyone reacting to it. Drop your thoughts in the comments, not just what you believe happened, but why you see it that way. Because at the end of the day, the loudest version of a story isn't always the most accurate. It's just the one that survived the most reposts. The deeper layer of the situation starts with how quickly different versions of events began spreading after the initial incident. Some accounts focus on location details, others on who was present, and others on what was allegedly said in the aftermath. None of it ever formed a single confirmed timeline, but each version added another piece to a story that never fully aligned. And now, years later, those same fragmented accounts are being reassembled by the internet in real time. What pushed things further was a claim circulating online that someone directly connected to the situation had allegedly spoken privately to family members, giving a different interpretation of what happened. Again, nothing verified, but the wording of these claims, especially the idea of explaining it to family, created a wave of speculation. Because that kind of detail changes how people emotionally interpret everything. It shifts the conversation from public rumor to private revelation. And that's where the internet starts filling in blanks that may not actually exist. As the discussion escalated, older footage and posts related to Lil Jeff started resurfacing again. Clips of friends speaking about him, messages posted after the incident, and commentary from people who were loosely connected to the environment all started circulating together as if they formed one unified timeline. But they didn't. They were separate moments being merged into a single narrative by repetition and timing. And that's what made the situation so unstable. Because every repost added weight, even when the original source of the information wasn't clear anymore. Meanwhile, commentary pages began framing the situation like a developing story again, using dramatic language and stitched clips that suggested confession had taken place. But when you trace it back, most of it points to indirect interpretations, not confirmed statements. Still, the emotional impact on viewers was real, because Lil Jeff's story already carried heavy weight in the community, and any suggestion of hidden truth or unresolved explanation immediately triggers strong reactions from people who have followed the situation from the beginning. The most intense part of the early escalation wasn't even the rumor itself, but how fast people started assigning meaning to silence. No direct confirmations appeared. No official statements backed the claims. But that absence of clarity became the center of attention. People started asking why nothing was being addressed if the story being shared online wasn't accurate. Others argued that silence doesn't confirm anything at all. It just shows that the situation is being misunderstood and amplified. But in viral environments like this, silence rarely reduces attention. It increases it. As the conversation grew, different communities online began splitting into interpretations. Some treated the situation as pure misinformation built from recycled posts and emotional reaction. Others believed there was more happening behind the scenes that had never been publicly explained. And in the middle of those two perspectives, the narrative kept expanding without any official anchor. Because once a story reaches this stage, it no longer depends on confirmation. It depends on momentum. And that momentum is what leads into the deeper part of the situation, where the internet starts trying to connect people, timelines, and private conversations into one continuous chain of events, even when there's no verified link between them. And that's exactly where the next layer of the story begins.